and I have the honor of introducing our speakers today. We have quite a big audience here, which is testament to the very interesting project that our speakers are involved in. And I've been looking forward to this particular presentation since I last heard them at the Post-Colonial Linguistics Conference. It was very, very interesting. So we have 4 speakers today. Firstly, Mary Rose Hermes, who is a professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and director of a nonprofit organization, Grassroots Indigenous Multimedia, or GIM. GIM has created and published over 25 children's books in Ojibwe, hundreds of hours of archive documentation of Ojibwe, conversation and a learning software, Ojibwe 7000. Then we have Mel Engman. Mel is a white settler language researcher from the United States who works as a lecturer in Northern Ireland. Her research addresses questions of power in multilingual educational contexts and has been published in journals such as Classroom Discourse, the Modern Language Journal, and Linguistics and Education. We then have Anna Schick. Anna is a doctoral candidate in literacy, language, and culture. Her research explores critical writing pedagogy as relational experiences with humans and non-humans. She has co-edited a book titled Re-Narrating Teacher Identity and engages in work on artifactual critical literacies and participatory literacies. Lastly, we have Aila OLoughlin, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at North Hennepin Community College. Their primary areas of research include philosophy of education, practical ethics, feminist philosophy, and philosophies of resistance. They taught high school English and college preparation for 10 years in both Oakland, California, and Minneapolis, and are currently learning their mother language of, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce, Davisa Migiela. I'm sorry, I butchered that, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, do you have a presentation to share? Here we go.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
It's so discombobulating being traveling time and space, braving the internet. So thanks for coming. Thank you for the introduction, Mara. I'm really interested in the work on language and emotion because our presentation today, Co-Conspiring with Land, the project has given launch to an awful lot of thought about not just being on land, but being in our bodies, which is of course about emotion and healing from trauma and healing all those relationships that have to do with where our languages evolve from in that particular place and how we talk to those animate and inanimate beings. And I think that's, we have all directions that we've taken in that work. So I'll just do a quick introduction. The seminal work, one of them was a documentation project, an NSF grant that was called Forest Walks. I mean, it had a longer formal name, but that's what we call it. And we use point of view cameras to capture a moment of time where we have speakers who are young children at Wadukarareng, our immersion school in Hayward, Wisconsin, for now 20 years, are producing fluent speakers in Ojibwe. So we have young people who can actually fluently and casually speak in Ojibwe and walk in the woods. And we still have elders, not very many, but who are first in an unbroken chain. So we recorded them with point of view cameras walking on land, Ojibwe reservation land in northern Wisconsin, and just talking and constructing meaning. And sometimes they would talk to the land. That's how we interpreted it in our transcriptions. We actually gave land a turn because they were listening, they were looking, they were observing, they were silent. They responded to land. So some of our questions, other than how do we stop the oil from flowing, the tar sands oil flowing from Canada into the United States, are things like, what does language look like? I mean, this has given me an idea of Morphemes are agglutinating indigenous languages based on morphemes, not on words at all, not on nouns, not on words, not on memorization, not on decontextualized, but on parts of words that hook together like building blocks that are very much related to the land and conjure a completely different way of communicating with the land it comes from. So what is in relationship? So we argue that from an indigenous epistemology, we are in a web of relationships. And if we make that major paradigm shift, which we are still always fluidly, constantly trying to make, then what happens to our idea of relationships as the seminal point of communication for language? And why does this matter? I think all of you probably realize that we are a human species that has really hurt our mother, and we better figure it out. And the work of language reclamation has a lot to do with that. I have a bunch of projects I'll just tell you about. I told you about the morpheme cards, which I'm super excited about. So these are morphemes from petroglyphs that hook onto other words. This one means good. This one means bad. Already you can see they're not binary opposites in our language. They're morphemes that hook onto other words that have a whole different symbolic meaning. And I have a Spencer grant. These are all, I say I, but it's really we, community designed augmented reality app that the kids that I've just spoke about at Wadukarating, the teenagers, are helping us design to think about how we get families back on land and using language and learning language through use. So, Misa Umanik, I will hand it over to my colleagues. They can tell you about what they're up to. Uh-oh, was I muted the whole time?
No, I'm muted. Sorry.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Fong. Good morning, everyone. I'm actually going to start with my formal introduction. So, Munamalea Bores, Munamalea Aila, ya Munlea Minneapolis Edit, ya Mu Etni Lea Susan Senya, ya Susan Senya Mu Etni Lean Si the Gili, Si the Edit. So, my name is Aila, and I'm a philosopher who's primarily interested in philosophies of resistance, change, transformation. And in the past few years, I've taken on what I believe to be a personal project of learning my mother's language, my mother's Indigenous language. Both my parents are immigrants. My father's from Ireland and my mother's from the Arctic Circle. And I can speak to my personal experience with learning language from an access point of a web of relationships. So I actually took Mary Hermes's class in Indigenous language revitalization last fall. And the photo displayed is the project that ensued, connecting plant names that grow in boreal forests, both in the Arctic Circle and here around the Great Lakes. And so the Sarit is the word for blueberries in my mother's language, and Minin is the word in Ojibwe. And so I had tried to learn my mother and my grandparents' languages before from a perspective of here are some nouns, here are some verb charts. I was also busy and I had a kid and things like that, and none of that really worked for me. And so just like a little slice of being thrown into one of Fong's language classes means you're in a small group and you get this video, right? Like from a point of view camera about immersion, language, conversation, where there's space for the land to be speaking. And you go from there. So there's no, here's what you're gonna learn first. And with that, that there was a clear start for me with plant names. And it was only actually in that experimentation and curiosity and listening practice that I then remembered all of these plant names that I'd learned from my grandfather as a child. Now, of course, this is not just a personal project. So that makes me think about the how that comes to bear on philosophy, on ethics, right? When we learn through community relationality that includes with human beings and non-human beings, it actually adjusts the kind of ethical questions we're asking, right? And there are plenty of words in Sami, for example, like the word Sida, which is our word for band. So I'm a electoral member of my mother's band on the Finnish side of the border of Sapmi. And Sida means community, but it also means the responsibility we have to one another. And so I've been recently thinking about language learning and language paradigms and worldview that helps us get smarter about things like collective ethics, when it's not one person's responsibility, but when we all, I'm loosely calling this potluck ethics right now, but like you show up to a potluck and you don't just have, it's not on one person's responsibility to prepare the whole meal. We all come together with different parts of the meal. And how can we think about ethical responsibility, especially in terms of environmental ethics? That really seems like the only way, right? One person can't actually steward the earth and the environment. We each have a different role in that. And of course, that means you need to communicate with each other. Otherwise everyone shows up with chips and salsa. And of course, that also means that what's in season, what's available, literally from the earth, goes into what we bring to these potluck ethics. So those are some of the questions that I'm thinking about. And I'm gonna say Gitu, Meegwitch, and pass it on.
Meegwitch. Mel Engman Indigenous Nin Chumuk Manakwe, Dismishamel, Time Mahoney, Emil Fersta. My name is Mel Engman. I'm part of the crew. I'm a white woman born and raised in Wisconsin, Ojibwe land, and now I live in Belfast. So I was hoping to connect some of my work that I've done with the Forest Walks project with some of the work that I'm about to get started with here with Irish language reclamation. Because it's actually, by all the conversations we've had about land lately have really sort of helped me make sense of the kind of work I'm trying to do now in the place where I live now. So part of my work on the Forest Walks project was to transcribe the interactions. So this means that I was trying to find a way to represent, multiple points of view, these four-dimensional, relational, action embedded in this context that's very much alive and responding to the humans that are in it. I'm trying to put all that into a Word document, and it was impossible, but I was trying to do it because that's how we represent knowledge in academia, right? We show evidence for our assertions, and that evidence needs to be recognizable as evidence. And so it just kind of revealed to me how our options for representing knowledge in scholarship are so narrow. Certain texts are acceptable, but certain texts are not. Most are not, in fact. And as scholars, we're constantly sorting our language into these recognizable constructs, disciplines, and fields. And it seems, doing this work and trying to also build my identity as a researcher and figure out the kind of research that I want to do and that I'm able to do, it's really highlighted the colonial collection and categorization processes that are involved and how they create these kind of arbitrary boundaries around the kinds of knowledge and also just the ways of knowing. And it really limits what can be shared and what can be collectively known, like what we can know with each other. And so I actually see these boundary making practices reflected all the time in what I do and how I do my work, how I present my thinking at events like this one. I was initially hesitant to use this time to describe a language reclamation project that I'm just getting going here in Belfast, because I wasn't sure if the new project was land focused enough to talk about here, because I wanted to make sure that I was staying clearly within those boundaries of land and language, the research category. And that hesitation, made me think of this conversation I'd had with a friend of mine who's a white teacher in the US. It was a conversation about her dissertation about white teachers in the US. And she was saying that she wanted to use Indigenous methods and Indigenous theory because she found them really generative and they really allowed her greater complexity in her analysis. But my friend also said that she was really hesitant to do so because none of her participants were Indigenous. And I thought that's so interesting. You know, this is a study of settler teachers who are on Indigenous land all the time. And yet there's hesitation about when we can look to Indigenous philosophy and methods to make sense of this world on Indigenous land. So anyway, thinking about that conversation helped me understand how this Irish reclamation project here in Belfast in Northern Ireland that's concerned with everyday language renewal in urban spaces and urban schools is still actually related to Indigenous language reclamation and land. So just a little bit about the project, and then I'll pitch some questions and be done. So Irish medium schooling here has become an important means of asserting Irish identity, growing in urban Gaeltacht in Northern Ireland. And with many immersion efforts all over the world, you know, the pandemic really highlighted the trouble that comes with anchoring your decolonizing language aims in one institution. So for English dominant parents, homeschooling was really difficult. It was a minefield for teachers too. And it's clear that we need to do research now that intervenes in that boundary making of immersion schooling too. But we have to do it in a way that protects the Indigenous language from the dominant one. We can't just open the doors and say, let English in so that we can have fewer boundaries between home and school. We need to be more creative, I think. So with co-researchers, Alison McKenzie here at Queen's and Orla McGurk, who you can see pictured in that little picture holding a loaf of wheaten, we're working on a community-based reclamation project that connects school and home, and it connects kids and their caregivers, and it connects academic and family literacies. We're essentially asking families to bake together in Irish. The kids know the language, the caregivers know the kitchen, and we're focusing on everyday distributed knowledge of language and food to examine learning and knowing in Irish at home. So it's not particularly land focused at first glance, but it could be, or rather I think it should be after thinking about this some more. You know, embedded in food preparation are everyday practices of knowing and responsibility. Food literacies are embodied, they're collaborative, they're material. Food is a carrier of culture. It's a direct connection to the land. That's where food comes from. Without the land, we cannot eat. So I hope we can find ways to build relations with land, even in the city, because these urban Gaeltacht kitchens are also part of nature. And so I just wanted to tie it quickly to Indigenous language reclamation as a research paradigm. I think it's really important to talk about what that means. It means that language is not the end point, but rather it's the starting point. It's the point of entry to address colonial processes of dispossession. And so as I think about all of this, I guess I would ask, how can we connect all of our everyday practices with land? You know, the forest walks is really about the everyday language that we do with land. And I wonder how we do everything else. All of our everyday practices should be connected with land. And my big question is, in what ways can language reclamation serve as a point of entry for reestablishing relations with land, even when we're not in the forest, but we're just doing everyday work of, you know, maybe preparing dinner for family in the middle of a city like Belfast. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking now. Meet you, Meegwitch.
Thanks, Mel. I will continue this trend of thinking about how our work with the forest walks has provided a point of entry and given space to be thinking about how we approach our other projects or other work that we are up to. Again, I'm a PhD candidate in critical literacies. I've worked specifically with Fong in studying queer and feminist theories and collective literacies. And then I've worked collectively on the team in analyzing the forest walks. So watching the videos and analyzing the interactions. So from a critical literacy background, I have a lot of interest in the ways that human and non-human actions invite relationality. When we were analyzing the forest walks, and you can see the image on the top there is from one of the point of view cameras. And in analyzing the forest walks, I became really interested in the ways mobility, so the actual movement across land, contributed to a relational and evolving language. So language in this context of intergenerational Ojibwe language use on and with Ojibwe land gives ways to what Deloria or Wildcat would suggest, that it's an emphasis on the particular and the situated, rather than the generalizable. And this became a really important point as I began to think about the so what. So what happens when we are learning language, speaking language on or with land or place. So you can see from this image here, so this is a point of view body camera from a youth who is in the forest, and she is leading an elder towards a smaller tree. And you can, the audio that was recorded here, you can hear that her directive says Nashki, which means look at this. And that's a very specific language use here. And so her gesture, her movement, and her talk in this exact time, they're all evolving and they're in direct coordination with the land as she's trying to pay attention to the specifics of a maple tree. So we discussed a lot how evolving language is then situated, and it actually, the language then itself is unfolding with movements, gestures, interaction on the land. And as I moved into some other work, I think it was like this unfolding and evolving nature of language that I became really interested in when I was thinking about writing pedagogy specifically. So my current dissertation work takes up what is called collective memory work. And I'm doing this work with novice teachers. So they are first and second year teachers. And in this work, we wrote memories of our 2020 to 2021 academic year, which specifically in our space and time was a school year that followed the murder of George Floyd in our city, Minneapolis. It held an election and an insurrection. And for the specific teachers that I wrote with, it was a year of insecure and isolating teaching during COVID-19. And so our research on the forest walks and this co-conspiring with land, specifically through mobility and gesture, really supported my approaches and my imagination as I started to contextualize how we were going to represent our collective experiences of this year, how we were going to write or use language to talk about them. So I entered this work with a lot of questions, which I still have as part of any dissertation process. But first I was really wondering, like, how can place participate in memory work and in writing actively? So in this context, we relied on non-human subjects such as artifacts from the places they were in that last year. So this is all the way to chairs they were using, to a blanket that they would lay in their backyard when they had to be removed from their computers. So we were looking specifically at artifacts, and then below you can see we also did a lot of work with illustrated timelines that weren't timelines around our Western conception of time, but rather around illustrations of place. And we used returning to specific places, illustrating place, and artifacts as ways to think collectively about our experiences and how they were shared. So as I continue to think about writing pedagogy, I draw on our experiences about thinking about land and language to imagine the possible ways to decolonize writing pedagogy and actually invite relationality with our environments or the places we're in. Thank you. I'm going to pass this back to Fong, who will be able to just share some of our collective questions that we are asking.
Oh, thanks, Anna. We're so well coordinated. Go team. Okay, let's see. These are our questions. I'll just let you read them. You can see we are sort of intentionally multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, which is part of our work in decolonizing the academy. Is there more? These are extra slides I think we had. You know, there's a lot of ways we could go now. I don't know, I'm not keeping track of the time, but I think we wanted to hear from Sinfree, right? As a discussant, and then kind of take it away from there. Was there anything else the collaborative had to say before we turn it over? No, I could stop sharing my screen then. Okay. And we'll just look at each other. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for this fascinating project. I want to begin by saying I am in general sympathy with the projects that you are all engaged in. So the questions that I'm going to raise should be understood as an attempt on my part to seek for clarity, right? That generally I subscribe to what you're trying to do, although at times I'm not sure what I'm agreeing about, right? So I'm trying to clarify a couple of things for myself. And now you can help me think this through. You talked about the importance of, you said, what does language look like, for example? My immediate question was, why didn't you ask, how does language feel like? Why was the issue of perception of language more important than how language feels like? Language, you're not supposed to feel language, you're supposed to see language. Ontologically, can I not say, this is how I feel, this is how language feels like? Can I say, this is how Swahili feels like to me? This is how Arabic feels like to me. Mm-hmm. That's the first question, then we can what? Mm-hmm.
So you want us to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about that, then we can.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I love that question. Mm-hmm. Because mostly language does feel, I mean, that's the only reason I've kept going all these years, because you get those feelings. The good feelings actually outweigh, you know, the mind feelings that say you can't do this, you're stupid, you're making a mistake, that wasn't right. So, and when we look at the land, and we're talking about language with the land, those are feelings too, really, yes. So I love that idea. I have to think more about that. I wonder what other people want to say in response.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's such a great point that you raise. Language is something you feel, for sure. I think that question came from our attempts to talk back to the field as we were, you know, as like I talked about my struggles with transcription. You know, when you transcribe what like structural linguistics would call language, you just have some text. But it's actually so much more. It's also embodied. It's quiet. Language can be unspoken. It's held with gaze. It's held with touch. It's held in emotion. And so it's just I think that question, probably when we first posed it, was directed more to the field. But I think that your point about just directing us to feel it in our bodies is really right on. Makes a lot of sense.
Right. Then my next question is about the nature of language use and the interaction between humans and non-humans linguistically. Let me backtrack a little bit. I agree from the bottom of my heart. I buy into the idea that linguistics should not be about the analysis between language use between humans for the following reasons. I cannot ideologically accept a linguistics that says language is only used by humans. Because if you follow that route, it doesn't take you very far to get into a situation where some other people are not regarded as humans, right? So my objection to a linguistics that focuses on humans is because through colonial encounters, slaveries, other people were regarded as less than humans. So to avoid that path, I can only radically say I prefer linguistics that includes every species, right? Otherwise, you run into a problem where linguistics only deals with the language of white males, etc., and everybody else is not a human being. So that is where I am coming from. And then what I'm really interested in, which I want to talk through with you, is if we buy seriously that we can interact with other non-human species, how does that linguistics look like? Right. Because we've got no alternative. If we say we can interact with the land, we can do this. How does that linguistics, or how do those studies look like? Let's say I want to study language and gender in interacting with the land. How would that play itself out? Right. Or is it that, yeah, let me stop there first. Yeah, okay, let me rephrase it. Let me rephrase it. If we are serious that linguistics should not focus and revolve around human beings, the challenge we are faced with is what are the analytical apparatus that we have to bring to bear to make that that research project doable, right? Because we now are interested in, we accept for the time being that there has to be a linguistics of the land. Now my question is, I'm teaching some undergraduate students, and then they ask me, how do you do this now? Let's say they agree with it. Now they want to know how to go about it. So that is what I'm trying to check.
It's sort of like the teachers we get, the pre-teachers we get, and they just want to say, okay, I get that, you know, we're all racist, but what, just tell me what to do. I mean, I think this is the direction, like it, I love Leanne Hinton's work, and she talks about how we have to use, you know, the things, the mechanics, the blueprints we get from linguistics to revitalize. And then we also have to use the bootstrap room. We have to use context. We have to use home. We have to use relationships we care about and things we're motivated to say. And then we put all those together. So I think about language revitalization, and I think about linguistics maybe from that angle. But I mean, I do have these cards, right? Like, these are petroglyphs. These are rock carvings that are 3,000 years old from Lake Superior that actually translates into morphemes. So maybe this is still language teaching, but so this means good or minnow. And then, and here's the petroglyph, it means bad or mon. And those are morphemes. So that's a clue to me, like, you know, the morphemes hook onto, you know, because you're a linguist, they are building blocks. And if we're teaching small children language, why don't we use symbols that they can easily redraw rather than Roman orthography, for one thing? So that is the land speaking to me, right? If that helps with your question of how do we do it? I mean, maybe we have to, I mean, it feels like such baby steps. Maybe we have to start looking to the land for clues. Like, I got really interested in rocks during COVID. I mean, really interested in rocks. And that's how I came to discovering that there's a ton of morphemes that are actually really useful as a different approach for becoming a speaker of the language.
Yeah, I see what you mean. The issue about rocks and connects to issues about ceramics, etc., leads me to the idea that perhaps what we're trying to do here is to craft notions about language which are not so much representational, but which accept that non-human artifacts can communicate, albeit a different type of communication. And that is where currently my mind is at. That the linguists have been too much in a hurry to say that language is finished business, that we now know what are all the building blocks of language. And then by so doing, I think they've excluded more exciting aspects and potentials of language, right? We know language have A, B, C, and D, and that those are the templates across the world. My feeling is that there is more to that other typologies of language that we should be thinking about, and not think that that issues about language are settled business. Because if you think that ceramics can talk, if you think that artifacts can communicate, you need a very different understanding of language, right? Yeah. So linguistic thinking or linguistic teaching should constitute, we need to unlearn a lot about the assumptions that we're making about language. That is, so a good course, a good graduate course in linguistics should end up encouraging students to unlearn what we think are the orthodox views of language. But that's okay, is what I think about the world.
Right. I think Anna wants to say something. Can I just say one quick thing? So Anna, you said, that this is about the particular and the situated, as Wildcat and Deloria write about, right?
Yes.
So here's another clue. We're not going for the grandiose explanation, the universal explanation. We're not going for the universal device in our head that understands grammar. We're not doing that, right? Yeah. We're starting over and stepping back and being silent in our bodies in particular places. And maybe we're going to come up with all kinds of different ways of knowing language that we haven't thought of. So I think Anna wanted to say something. I'm going to mute myself.
I was just going to add that we looked a lot with this project at just participant structures and what happens when we include humans and non-humans into the participation of language. And so when you're asking the question, especially, from an undergrad perspective or a student perspective of like, how do we account for this, or how do we look at this critically? One way that I know I entered was just looking at who is participating here. And then what shifts does that actually make? And we actually just observed a lot of very interesting shifts, like being on land. How does that shift the participation of the youth and the elder, for example? And then I'm seeing that work with artifacts as well right now, that we think about like it as like a listening praxis. Like when we have artifacts present, this is evoking a world or a place or a space. And if you just listen comparatively to the types of narratives that are evoked from that praxis point or that participation point, rather than just the storytelling or the back and forth just between two humans, I think that's just one way that I've just started to see the differences of who's participating, who and what are participating in language.
And I can add a little bit to that from the point of view of the non-linguist. So having never taken one linguist.
I think you're better off, I can tell you that.
But if undergrads asked me that, if they said, how do I start? I would say you've already started, because I think when you say the word orthodox, and I think one of the many important parts of land-based centered interlocking language learning is that none of us can separate ourselves from land. Like we are in relationship with land. Every day. We live on land, we come from certain land, the food that we eat is land-based, we go about our lives in connection to the land. And so rather than going out saying, I need to start in this way. I think that's a through line between all of our individual projects as well, right? Like I love that Fong was into rocks during COVID, and I bought a house, and so I was planting a garden. And Mel's in the city and cooking. So I think that those, like, everyone's already in contact with the land that we're learning from. And like Fong said, it's really a choice of being silent or being in different kinds of relationship, but the relationships are already there, which is nice. It's easy.
Yeah, yes. That's why I think I agree with you about the idea of relational ontologies. That's
Big man's back. www.thekidfrombrooklyn. You ever see them signs on the highway billboards? You used to walk a mile for a camel, or cigarette commercials. The guy used.
We've been invaded.
Or
Is he
maybe
gone?
just someone was unaware that their mic was on.
Yes, this person's mic was on.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. That's why it's good to mute everybody. Yeah? Okay, do you want to unmute me? Okay, right. I agree with you about the issue of relational ontologies, that you're always in relationship to the land or to some other aspect, and that it is that relationship that is much more fundamental than the entities themselves. I like the idea of being of the relationship with the land, but currently my thinking with Chanel is we've been doing a lot of reading on relationship between language and oceans, language and water, language and the sea, for example. Because I'm told a large part of our bodies are water anyway. So the linked to, in a way, parallel to what you guys are doing, I'm asking myself together with Chanel, how do my views about language or society change if I take ocean, water, as my fundamental building blocks? All right. So it's sort of similar to what you guys are doing, but we are trying to ground it in oceans, water, and epistemological. And I think that would be my last question. Otherwise, we can talk forever. The other people will have got more interesting questions to raise. Raphael.
Yes, thank you for initiating this very interesting discussion. And I'm going to start looking at the chat interventions here. I've already started actually, and I say that there is a question by Ty Butler. I see that John Joseph also wrote a comment. Sally Coco has raised his hand, and an intervention by Peter as well. So I will start with Ty Butler's question. These language projects seem like they would have profound impacts on community and identity. I'm curious how these approaches have intersected with and informed something like land tenure, community governance policies, and the ownership or non-ownership of land.
I guess I wanted to say one thing about being very sort of a language activist, if you will. So, and interdisciplinary. So I do tend to work across areas and in small contexts. So although I could say things about land tenure and community and identity, I don't have big policy things to say at this point. But I think one of the things I wanted to say in relation to the conversation we were just having as well, is that it is a big difference to think about language learning, right? I mean, we think about language learning, we think about what? Being in buildings, we think about being verb paradigms, we think about memorization. but language use as learning in context, we know that's the natural way to learn anyway, right? So that to me is how we get back to land. If we think about using, and I've done that in several of my projects, and this goes to Ty's question. I think the best language camp I've ever had was this May. We had 4 weeks together. We did online stuff, and then we met together. There's a puppy who wants to say something. And I did what Aila talked about. I did, I'm not going to make a plan. I did this Indigenous pedagogy thing. I'm going to respond to where we are and who we are and make sure everybody feels good. We had intergenerational families there. Some of those elders, older people said, I've been in language class all my life and I failed and I still can't speak Ojibwe. And I said, wherever you are, it's all right. It's, we're going to start where you are. We're going to be here. They took out canoes. We camped at the headwaters of the Mississippi. They felt connected. They felt alive. We feasted the water. That's how we started. So it is whatever you want to call it, spiritual, scientific. It's one category now, right? It was all of those things and very experimental, but the use of language was profound because the teenagers could speak and mostly we let them lead. And we made sure we felt good on the land and felt connected and paid respects to the land and paid attention to the land. So, and yeah, it was great for everyone's identity. So that's what I have to say to Ty. Thanks for the question. Does anybody else want to respond?
I guess so.
Oh, I was going to add.
I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I similarly, I'm still pretty new in Belfast and I don't have a lot of policy things to say about land and community governance, but I would say that as a settler, learning the language of the place that grew me really shifted how I can relate to that land itself. And it's really shifted how I see the relations of that land with all the people who now live in relation to it. And so I think that this is, again, where language reclamation as an approach is really important, because if you are actively engaged in trying to do the language that was grown and cultivated in that place, it's the language of that place, you can't avoid as developing some sort of a relationship with that place.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a language crowd here, right? This is how we've gotten to this point of reclaiming so much. And I asked one of those young people the other day, how many language activists do you know who think about land at all? And he said, none of them.
Would anyone else like to add something else before we move on? Then, Coco Monfene, I see that you have raised your hand. Please feel free to ask your question or make your comment.
Yeah, it's both a question and a comment about what has transpired so far. I want to note that language is pervasive in our lives. And when we put language in perspective, it's multifaceted. And there is no single linguistics course that can cover all aspects. And what we see is that there's sociolinguistics, there's linguistic anthropology, there's formal linguistics, there's philosophy of language. And I have advocated for language and economics and things like that. And so I can understand a comment that I took from Mel when she was speaking, introducing the topic, that language is an entry point and not an end point. Yeah. And so, and the whole project, unfortunately, it's sketchy to us, but I understand it as because colonialism has marginalized indigenous people indigenous and dispossess indigenous people of their land and so forth. We can reclaim things in rising against colonialism by first reclaiming, not first, using language to reclaim everything. And the project, as I understand it here, is reclaiming language in context, that you may not reclaim enough of language just by teaching a case here with Irish for over 100 years. Irish has been taught in school. I don't know whether Irish is also used as a medium of instruction, but we don't see much evidence of significant revitalization of Irish, and that is disappointing. And so, in other words, if you capitalize just on school, you may not gain a lot of mileage, but if you do it in context where people find the language practical and useful for something, it means something, and it can be quite productive. And because language is so multifaceted and pervasive in our lives, language gives you entry points to different aspects of culture. And I think one thing that is missing in your program is language at work. And that's what I meant by language and economics. For many people, I think for most people, you want to earn a living in your language. And one of the real problems now is, regardless of what you do, people still wonder, will I survive in the new socioeconomic world order in my language, or do I need the other language to survive in the new socioeconomic world order? And I think that is something that I found missing in, from your program. But otherwise, the idea of doing things in an integrated way, and where you find language significant in many ways. So it doesn't have to be just in nature. It could have been in some sort of profession, and you make language valuable and so forth. And I think that must be articulated forcefully. A utilitarian approach to language. That's what I'm suggesting here.
Sally Coco, is that right? Sally Coco?
Yes, and people just call me Sally.
Sally Coco, thank you
It's
so much.
colonial, but it's fine, Sally Coco.
Sally Coco, I admire your work, I know it, and I thank you for your comment. I've thought this many times. I mean, obviously we don't have the answer to everything, we're just doing our bit. But especially, you know, for people who immigrate, like we're talking with some Hmong people here, there's a lot of Hmong people. And with the immigrants, you know, they're really working hard to survive. And that means having a job in English. So they're losing their intergenerational transmission of Hmong or Somali or all these languages. And it's about work. It's because you don't have the time. Unless you're a language teacher or an Ojibwe immersion teacher, you don't have time to spend your whole day talking Ojibwe. It's true. I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah. But if I can respond to that, I think a problem with the, let me see, the dominant approach or response to language endangerment and loss is a solution that fits all situations, and there is none. And you don't fight language endangerment among immigrants in the same way that you fight language endangerment in a place where the indigenous population has been marginalized, because concerns are really different. They have, and the consequences of your solutions are going to be very different. In one place, you really need to empower the indigenous population and make them competitive in their own languages, in their own traditions. How are you going to do that? You have to start talking with economists. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with economists in Australia and in New Zealand. I'm sorry, I confused them. In New Zealand, and they were asking me, what would you advise us? And I said, I've never set foot in New Zealand. I wouldn't know what the local dynamics in your population structure are. And you are economists. You think about empowering people economically. Find out how you can empower the Maori in Maori so that not only they can survive economically in Maori, and it imperative to learn Maori for their own survival, at least socially, things like that. But for people that are immigrants, here we have a long history that informs us. I think a lot of people that have been publishing on language endangerment and loss, they are descendants of continental Europeans in an Anglophone country, and they have become Anglophones. I don't know whether they remember that they too have lost their heritage languages. Okay, and that's one of the things that we have to pay attention to. And why didn't it work with white Americans that have been given privileges in functioning in the new socio-economic? Yes. Okay. White Americans from continental Europe have been given privileges to survive competitively in an Anglophone world, and the price has been giving up the heritage languages, the cultural practices, and then we have to realize in the process there is an American system that has emerged. When white Americans travel abroad, they don't say we are Europeans. In Europe, they don't recognize themselves as Europeans. So we have to try to understand these things. And so with the recent immigrants, how are we going to advise them if we don't want them to follow suit, that follow the lead of white Americans that have become Anglophone and have Americanized, for that matter. There is actually a book that establishes a connection between language and land, and it's written by a historian, Sean Avery. It's titled Native Tongues. And when you read it, you will see the whole scheme in the Americanization enterprise that schemes things very diligently in dispossessing Native Americans of their land and so forth, and made the loss of language a consequence of this economic and political scheming. So that people realize too late this was unavoidable, it was going to happen, and it has happened. So that book, I would really recommend it to all of you that want to establish a connection between loss of language and land. You'll find it in that book. It published in 2018.
Thank you, Sally. I will move on now to actually Desmond Odugo, who said that he has a thought about Sally Coco's comment. So just so we can use the timing for that, if Desmond is there, we would like to share his thought with us. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Fong and everyone who's presented. I think Sally Coco got me thinking about something else from a different perspective. I wondered if one could consider not focusing on language and economics, especially within this neoliberal capitalist condition as an act of resistance. That is, if I were to wonder about how indigenous peoples around the world lived their lives in relation with land and depended on land prior to capitalism, would it make sense, at least from a research standpoint, to try to retrace those steps in the ways that that might still be surviving? So too, the point that Fong, you were talking about, the work you were doing with indigenous people and walking that land, might one construe that as an act of resistance and refuse to go to the factories, so to speak? I just wondered about that and wondered if you had a thought.
The forest walks was actually inspired by a friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Megan Bang, and she did forest walks in Chicago. And her forest walks were inspired by the Ojibwe water walker women who, there's been a movement in this country for the Native American women, especially the Ojibwe women, who walk the perimeters of the Great Lakes or walk the length of the Mississippi and talk and listen and learn. And it's a spiritual journey, right? And they learn and they teach and people join them. And it's a prayer for protection for those water spirits. So could you remind me, could you rephrase the first part of your question? I didn't really understand that part.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking out loud that I think of academic scholarship often as complicit in systems of power and coloniality that often we claim to challenge, because we build our scholarship after those systems. I think we are already in a very problematic position because many of us are working from within academic institutions that are steeped in processes of coloniality. But then when the presentations of coloniality is taken for granted and then we're trying to study it. I think your comment earlier about people being at work where they are required to speak English for survival. If we focus our research on that, might we be affirming that system, right? Is there something about resistance that can be performed by refusing to pay attention to something? That is there something political about attention here? That is to say, I'm not going to follow you to the factory. I'm not going to study your engagement with or your feeling about or experience with language at the factory. Let's do that at the river walk or the forest walk, and so forth. That's just
There's a quote from Adrienne May Brown in Emergent Strategies that says, "Pay attention to what you want to grow," which I think of often in the academy as we focus on, the critical and the deconstruction and, how have we gotten here and all this. But if we want things to grow, there really feels like there's a revolution, not just because I'm sitting in Minneapolis with my George Floyd shirt on and protecting the water, but in little places everywhere, it feels like there's an opportunity to change. So many people, to even have a conversation with an esteemed group like this about, yes, the land talks to us. The land has language. That is great to hear. That's pretty revolutionary, I think, for linguistics. So no, I don't have like a grand Marxist scheme of one revolution. I think there's little fires happening everywhere. And sometimes, it does look like, you're participating in it to work in teacher education or whatever. But, those are people that need jobs and our kids need to go to school. And that's part of what's going on right now. So those things, I think the comment about the forest walks really got me thinking, that's kind of elitist. Like, not everybody gets to, they're at work. They don't get to go on forest walks. I gave them good stipends and we did it on a Saturday so families could come out. It's kind of, and there is an elitism in the people who have really proficiently learned Ojibwe as adults. They've been to college. They have jobs as language teachers. It's still very, very hard, but there's a sort of an economic skew there. And what about the people working 3 jobs at the casinos who are singles moms and can't take a language class. What about them? I think that's a good question. So I don't know if we need to go to the factories and start speaking Ojibwe, how that would go, but it's good to think about.
That's an inspiring picture. I will move on now to read a comment that John Joseph wrote some time ago now in reference to the question that Sinfrey asked in the beginning when students ask him, okay, so how to actually do this, right? And then the comment John Joseph made was, Sinfrey, you won't find the answers to all your students' questions there, but it's worth having a look into zoosemiotics or biosemiotics, e.g. work by Kalevi Kuhl. One of our problems as linguists is that we think about semiotics as another universe. And if John Joseph is still around, I wonder if he'd like to expand on that a bit, or if the invited speakers would like to respond. Let's see if...
Nothing to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe there was a no thanks then.
I thought you wanted him to elaborate his question.
Yes.
Nothing, it's not a question, Sinfrey, it's just a suggestion that actually, I think we've talked a lot about linguistics today. The word semiotics has never come up, but a lot of what we're doing is pointing towards semiotics. And I would just, one of my life missions is to encourage my fellow linguists to lose their fear and loathing of semiotics.
Thank you. I will then move on to ask Cristina Severo's question. She starts by thanking a lot for this lovely conversation, very inspiring. Since land may mean different things, experiences to different people and geopolitics, how do you frame what counts as land?
Yeah, we're using the term very indexically. I mean, just to refer to wherever you are in the connection to the earth. Because every tribe, every nation, every language that is grown in those places has a different epistemology about what counts as alive and not alive. In Ojibwe, I could say the things that we think are alive, but even I think the inanimate count as land. So it's a very general term, and we have not refined it. I don't know if Aila or Mel or Anna want to say anything about that, but we're sort of using it as a placeholder for now to mean the connection to the earth wherever you are. It may mean ocean, sky, all of those things.
I think I would just add that returning to the point about the specific and not the generalizable. We've had some response to our work at some point that's like, oh, if we just get outside, then that works or something. But just thinking about what are the specific contexts, what are the specific places and land that are connected to the people and the language that we are thinking about.
Thank you, Fongren Anna. And now I will pass on the word to Sangeeta Bhagagupta, who wrote to me saying that she has some queries.
Thank you very much. This is inspiring, and I'm coming from the discipline of education, so and language, so I relate. And I will start off by saying that I'm also sympathetic to your project. So my queries are more related to things that I struggle with in my own writings. And as you were presenting, I was reminded of a 2018 book by Stephanie Springay and Sarah Truman, who I'm sure you're aware of. I was quite taken in by their book. I think it was called something like Walking Methodologies in a more than human world. And they play around with different concepts, land and geos, effect, movement. And when I was looking through that volume, I think a year ago, I thought of what Sinfri, you mentioned, you know, the water. So what is land? Has land become something that we need to hold on to? And I'm a bit worried because when you expand now that you're using land indexically, okay. And Anna, when you say that it's the specifics and it's the situated, I can agree. But there is this whole tradition in the language sciences, which has a very strong colonial bent. And that is the language, the nation state connection, the monolingual ethos that we haven't been able to shake despite having kind of been aware of. So that is part one of my question. And the other is things that I have written about in the what is now being understood is the entanglement of the human and the non-human. So artifacts, as one of you very rightly said, that is part of what we do. Most important tool. We can never be outside of language. And there my question comes to, I think it was you, Anna, who said, you had one question, how can we decolonize writing? So what would you then mean by what is colonizing of the language pedagogy? So that's a question to you. But my larger concern is with this language and place connections, the analog and digital in current time spaces. So why are we focusing so much on land, given that we have, not just because of the pandemic, but we are living in digital times. We are connecting digitally. So I think I made three questions. The first was related to the monolingual nation state specter that continues to survive. A specific question to you, Anna, about what would colonizing writing pedagogy look like? And the third was related to the digital.
Do you want to start, Anna?
Sure. That question about decolonizing writing pedagogy for me was looking at current writing pedagogies that begin with the actual physical act of writing. That when we start talking about a writing process, that begins with the literal writing or the production of text. And when I think about decolonizing that, I'm thinking about what are other experiences. For example, writing method or walking methodologies was quite interesting to me. That we can reframe and re-see as writing and language in those particular experiences. So I think for me, I'm trying to understand what are ways that we can expand this understanding of what would be considered writing pedagogy or what would be considered engaging with language that doesn't have to rely on the production of text solely in that way. And then I don't know, Fang, you might have something to speak to digital spaces, but that was something that came up a lot, clearly speaking with teachers who were teaching during COVID-19. And then going back to Sinfri, your first question about language and feeling, just how that particular space changed the way language felt, the way it could land, the way they could interact, because of the absence of space and artifacts and place that happened in that digital world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we are all just like sitting right now. Look, I can get up and move. I could go outside. All of you could probably do that too. right? So we are just recreating a pattern we had of being inside in buildings together. But I keep quoting Arundhati Roy and saying, maybe the pandemic was a portal into how we could be. So I don't think the digital is against land. I mean, that's how I became able to have the space to spend more time on land, because I couldn't be around people and I got my work done on the computer. And then I could go outside, which is what I lived outside most of the pandemic, in the wilderness or in the desert or wherever we were camping. So to me, like, why can't we use the digital to be outside more and spend less time commuting and being in buildings? That's what I'm wondering about when I think about the digital and land and language. And I don't know if maybe Mel or Aila want to also say something.
Fong, I just wanted to remind everyone of the work you're doing right now with the Spencer Foundation that actually brings digital technology, like uses digital technology to help mediate language-land relations. I thought that would be maybe a good thing to mention here.
I was gonna say the same thing, like, and as someone who is not technologically advanced, and then Fong's out here making apps and using point of view cameras and runs a multimedia company, that like organization. Like and it's not really a point of conversation so much, almost like, okay, put your energy, put your focus on what you care about. And I haven't been a part of the conversations, if there have been, about like, is the digital age at odds with land, or with, there's no conversation about that. You're just calling on digital resources and technology and innovation and these languages that typically younger people are more fluent at than me at this point, and you're doing language reclamation and revitalization with those digital languages like all the time, to the point that it's funny that never talked about that. But
yeah, it's not that I know how to do all these tech things. I just work with people who do. What I'm curious about is the limitation of, I think learning language is talking to people. Like, the most exciting thing is not knowing what they're going to say and talking. So that is the most problematic thing in recreating in our virtual reality game right now. Like, we don't have a digital response. I don't want a computer to talk back to people, but we want maybe the rocks are going to say something to you, and it should be a spontaneous interaction. So that is a digital challenge right now, but we're thinking about it. If anybody has ideas or has a dev team, that's what I have recently learned I need.
Thank you. If I can share a challenge that I have as chair of the discussion now, is that there are too many questions and too little time. So we have 4 more minutes before the formal part of our discussion ends. And I see that there are 2 more interventions in the chat box and 2 more people who would like to speak, Anissa and Mari. So I will try and ask the questions in the chat before I pass the word to Anis and Mari. So the first one from Aila OLoughlin. There's a set of questions. I think I will ask the first one then, and then see how it goes. So Holly writes, I'm wondering, what do the symbols for good and bad, for example, represent? It is what it's observed from the land?
Give an answer quickly, because I have not done that kind of research yet, and I'm still trying to connect with someone that has. But there's a book called by Ron Martin and Carl Gabaway that wrote about the geology of the Great Lakes and started some of this. So I don't know, there's petroglyphs all over, and these are just the ones that I found. So minnow is the word in Ojibwe for good, and I don't even want to say that. We interpret it in English as good, as the morpheme for good. So if we translate Minnow Bamadaziwan is good life. So there's Minnow and Bamadaziwan is life, or Minnow Gijigud, or good day, or Minnow Pogwad, it tastes good. So that's how it works. But you know, it's just sort of a baby understanding at this point, because I don't even know that translates completely. So that's, you know, and there's more, but it's a budding project that I'm sort of crowdsourcing, because it came from the rocks and from people who said, why are we teaching English through Ojibwe through Roman orthography?
Thank you. And then there is an intervention in the chat box by Adrian, and we'll start from the place where Adrian frames the question, which refers to a piece of advice from Paulo Freire. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of man on their world in order to transform it. Those committed to the cause of liberation can either accept the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to fill, nor the use of banking methods of domination in the name of liberation. And the question Adrian asks is the following: how do we interpret such a pedagogic paradigm as yours in the context of globalization?
Well, that's what we're doing. I mean, we are looking at the specifics, and I think we would encourage other people working in other languages and other places. Like, I'm interested in the South African folks, and if they're Zulu or Xhosa or Shona or what your languages are, because, you know, I did a Paulo Freire project in 1980 in Zimbabwe, a participatory theater project in a Shona village. So that principle of working back and forth between the theory and practice has long stayed with me. And I think it invokes in this project the very local, and working from there and then going back to theory and then going back around and around in that cycle. And I've learned a lot from that. So I'm interested in what other people have to say to this question about globalization and theory and praxis.
Would anyone like to jump in and share their thoughts on this? Or can I just pass on the word to Anissa?
Yes.
Yes.
Let Mari go first, because my comment can go into party time easily.
Okay, thank you. Mari?
I just wanted to make a comment on Sangeeta's part of her question about working methodology, and I want to clarify something. So working methodology comes from the tradition of sensory ethnography and arts creation and new materialism perspective. And she was asking a question about land. I think this forest walk project has a different premise, that it really values indigenous perspectives, and that's where land comes. So it's sort of dangerous to equate to the two the same. So walking methodology may be using forest walk, but from a very different ontoepistemological perspective. So they're not really equal. So I just wanted to clarify. So walking methodology is really more sensory ethnography and arts creation. It's really not trying to connect to the land and with the worldview behind it. So they're very different. So I just wanted to make a comment on that.
Thank you, Mari. Makoni, I will then pass on the word to you to see if you want to have some final comments.
I think this was a very interesting and insightful conversation. What will I remember about this? I think I'll remember the statement, which I think it was Mel who made that statement, which was then repeated by Sally, that you can carry out research in such a way that language is not the end point, but it's the entry point. And that's the way, personally, I want to see my own work going, that language simply happens to be the entry point to enabling me to think through other issues. The advantage of that is then I don't feel constrained by linguistics, applied linguistics, semiotics, etc., because those are just my entry point into concerns about life. Right. Because for me, from a very pedantic point of view, a linguistics that does not address issues that are pertinent to life is not worth my life's commitment. Right. If I have to be commit my life to linguistics, then there must be something that linguistics contributes to life. Right. I wouldn't see why I should sacrifice my life to linguistics if linguistics has nothing to offer life. That's why all these discussions about colonization and decolonization will always continuously be of interest to me, because they are dealing with issues that are pertinent to what I think life is all about. But having said that, I personally, that's why I like this project a lot, I have no problem with projects that seek to envision what a future might look like. The advantage of that is you feel a bit freed from the immediate concerns as you begin to imagine what will this discipline look like in the next generation or two. Right. So that's where I'm currently at the moment, and I sympathize quite a lot with what Mel and her team are trying to do. It is tricky, I know, but it is worth doing, I think. That's all that I have to say.
Thank you. Before we move on to the more informal after hours party of our meeting today, I'd like to ask, thank once again Phong, Anna, Aila, and Mel for their very interesting presentation and for the discussions that it generated. And I wanted to ask you if you wanted to share some final words before we move on.
Just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to reach so far across the world so conveniently in my own living room. And I would love to come back to Southern Africa again someday.
Which part of Zimbabwe did you go to?
Chiramanzu.
Chiramanzu, okay. I have a connection with that country. But that's a story for another day. Okay.
Story for another day.
Okay. Then I think it's Kim. Can you make the announcement about